So one of the things I think is interesting, and I'm speaking here as a founder of a small growing company, but also hopefully will be germane to many, many people in the audience in that case, is how do you, I think intuitively almost everyone these days sees that the world is changing, the way that we build and frame and design organizations need to change with that. But one of the things that is, I think, particularly hard today is we're in that middle ground, that transition. So not just folks our age, but even young people today.
He says our age, yeah. Well, it makes me feel young.
But, you know, have grown up in an educational system and paradigm where there is, you know, a lot of the momentum, even if it's cognitively sort of dissonant, is traditional sort of Taylorian hierarchical structures, linear paths, you know, productivity that you talked about sort of in a traditional sense. So if you try to go too far away from that, there's a very real sort of anxiety almost that builds up. You know, hopefully this will resonate with well, probably everyone here, but certainly the founders, that even if you're recruiting you know, a 22-year-old just out of school, that, you know, they're going to be worried about many of the same things that we were when we were leaving university 30 years ago. And yet it sort of at the same time seems like that's a world of the past. Do you have any sort of thoughts on how that transition might operate over the next, I don't, you know, you tell me how long, over the next 10 years? Will it take a generation?
I mean, a few quick observations on it. And then you know, when the last financial crisis happened, I remember, I think it was Umair Haq who said that the balance of open source is about privatizing losses and socializing gains. If you build something and it fails, you've carried all that. But if you build something and it succeeds and it's adopted, everyone gets the value. And so one of the crude ways of looking at the crisis then was saying, well, the opposite happened from a finance world where gains were sort of socialized, were privatized and losses were socialized. And then you want to understand why those things happen. Then it goes back to building ecosystems, building platforms. I mentioned earlier in our own conversation, remember Venkat, the professor I know from Boston, who said 20 years ago that institutions are morphing from being hierarchies of product and customer to networks of relationships and capabilities. That's a great statement to make in PowerPoint, but when you actually want to see what it means in an institution at work, saying, well, you know, do you actually get away without an org chart, right? Do people not care about who you report to? Does the division you report to matter, you know? And the reality is that increasingly growing on a daily basis, it doesn't matter. People actually want to know what you can do for them and what they can do for you. And you know, at Salesforce, they had something called V2MOM, which said that everyone in the institution had to write up 5 things. You know, your vision, what do you want to do? Your values, why is it important to you? Your methods, how you do it. The obstacles, what's going to stop you from doing it? And the measures, how would you know? And the first thing I realized about it is by writing your V2MOM, you don't have a job description anymore, because people, that was your job description. You know, why is what you do important to you? And you know, where I last worked, 40% of the people were millennials. And they're into, you know, we talk about things like, you know, ethical investing or value and impact investing, but actually people are making those choices with their jobs already. Okay, my children are. Yeah. Right? They're not, so the choices they make are, how is what I'm doing valuable, rather than what is my title and what's my reporting line. So when you say we're in transition, I think that transition is actually happening. And the structures of being able to say, thou shalt do this because I tell you so, are gone. Okay? Security of tenure of jobs isn't there. The attraction of guaranteed benefits is not there. Right? I don't know, maybe a decade ago I was saying my dad had 1 job. By the time I die, I probably have 7. But my children will have 7 at the same time. Yeah. Okay, and we don't mean that as portfolio careers, but people are making choices about where they put it. So it almost doesn't matter where you are. The focus, if we bring it down to saying there is value created. Value is not necessarily created through Taylorism or Fordism or hierarchical structures or the traditional ways of production. Okay? Part of that is because the cost of change of the traditional systems is greater than the pace of change of the market around, which is driven by the hyperconnectivity.
Yeah.
So if you cannot change as fast as that environment around you, right, you're going to fail.
So I want to veer off, take advantage.
Sorry,
I know you're,
I went random.
No, but I want to take advantage because I know you're passionate about this, and I think, going back even to root causes, I'll posit something. I don't know if it's entirely true. Feel free to push back if you think it's not true, but the education that our children have today, at least in the West, is substantially identical to the education that we had. And yet the world is completely different. You could even argue it when we were going, from K through 12, it was already maybe a bit anachronistic, but nothing has changed. And so we keep, as a society, keep creating people that are brought up in a paradigm that I think is more and more obvious to the students themselves, to young people themselves, is not really fitting the world that they work into. But is that, what, we're going to have to cut it short, but I thought maybe just even to sort of plant a couple seeds for future conversations this week or later, I'd be interested in your thoughts as to what role education or educational, the military-industrial complex of education has to, play in terms of how this is all playing out now and how it might play out in the next 5 or 10 years.
I'm not a teacher, and I don't mean to either threaten or insult people who are teachers. My daughter and my eldest child and her husband are teachers. So I say these things as a passionate amateur. I think that somehow, and I'm not the only person to have said it, we have industrialized the idea of education to become teaching becoming more important than learning. And the important thing to do is to be that learner and to be that lifelong learner. When we were, we used to be, born, live, die within 10, 15 miles of where we were born. When migration costs dropped after the Industrial Revolution, we learned to migrate for non-economic or disaster purposes. And it's taken us a long time to rebuild those communities. But I bring that together because when I was trying to study earlier communities, the village school was a single room, a single hall, a single tree under which you sat, which meant that you could not talk and talk to the person because the audience was heterogeneous. Right? We started standardizing audiences in order to empower the teacher, whereas if you didn't have a standardized audience, then you would have to manage the message in order to say you facilitate learning, you don't teach. So the whole culture of making someone think was different. I was a 13-year-old at school when we had a new maths professor, and he turned up and he said, so what are the maximum number of electrons in the nth orbit of an atom? And we were all looking at the guy and saying, this isn't physics class, this is maths class, why do you do this to us? 2n squared. And then he put a chalk out and said, prove it. And you can only sort of do that through an inductive proof of the 2, 8, 18, 32, sort of the shell, accretion. And so somebody did that, doesn't matter who. And then he looked at us while those of us who did it or could do it were feeling quite sort of smug, to say, from today, I will respect you for the questions you ask rather than the answers you give. Okay? We appear to have industrialized answering rather than questioning. And I was reminded of what Picasso was meant to have said about computers, saying computers are stupid, they only give you answers. Okay? And rekindling that questioning capacity, that curiosity, that I have not learned, I have found 10,000 ways that do not work. Allowing for failure to be part of learning. You know, Esther Dyson used to sign off her notes by saying, always make new mistakes. Okay? So something within the educational system to say making mistakes is okay, failing is okay, learning is what's important. And just a last data point on that, when MOOCs began, there used to be this set of rumors coming from some of the people working on these things to say there was very high take-up in India, and yet the completion rates were appalling. And I talked to a number of people in India after that who've been doing the MOOCs, and they said, yeah, because they consider completion getting a certificate. I never did it for the certificate. I did it to learn. Yeah. Okay, and we've got to move away from that output being necessarily the certificate to say what is important is learning. And the education system is changing, and it will change. I have faith in that. But switching away from saying it's not league tables, it's not teaching, it's not points, it's not attraction of funding to do with that, it is learning. And if we can celebrate learning.
I think, is there an analogy with what you were talking about before, the definition of what productive is, this sort of mindset, a paradigm that's very reductionist? It's similar with credentials.
Yes, and once you do that, you fall into building an entire pantheon around that reduced model.
So last question, and I'll open it up in case anyone else is. Changing tack a little bit, but there's an expression, I'm sure, well, I don't know if you've heard that, someone asked a fish, how's the water? And the fish, of course, asks, what's water? Yeah. In the context of I touched on this in my opening remarks. One of the things that I find really interesting is that taking that metaphor, applying it to finance, in the context that finance is built on this set of assumptions that water, this is how the world works, this is how life works, this is how productivity works. I talked about the life cycle, education, work, retirement. If that's all different, if the water is no longer water, but some other fluid or ether, then how does the financial, what opportunities are there for, certainly for people in this room, but the wider financial services industry to adapt to that? And what are the risks? Or and having worked worked with startups, but also worked in very large financial institutions, I'd be interested in your, high level, not specific, but high level, can machines that were built, sometimes very well, if we're honest, to serve that one environment, do they have a hope in hell of adapting to a completely different environment in terms of the types of products and services and their relevance to consumers? And consumers could be businesses or people, but the consumers of financial services.
Okay, I guess, I made the mistake, if you can call it that, of studying banking and economics at university. So if I sound a little dry as dust in the answer, forgive me on that. But I never thought, and I've spoken probably 4 years ago on some related themes, I never thought of anything to do with finance as being about money per se. Okay, as in the Peter Druckerian, shoes are the product, money is an end result. People make shoes. Money, whether you think of it as a unit of account, a medium of exchange, or a store of value, these are things that lubricate trade between people. And as soon as you accept that there is skill diversification within an ecosystem and some ability to be able to exchange value, and that value may not be always consumed and produced sort of at the same instant, then you need to have some idea of storing and some idea of accounts. And institutions will always exist to be able to make that happen, because things like identity, the trust that goes with that provable identity, the recourse that is implied in saying that the value is sustainable, all these things have been what banks have sort of circled around since we started using the term bank. For those of you who weren't here 4 years ago, I reminded people that even the word bank comes from the banco that the merchants of Lombardy used to sit on, and they would converse with each other, transact business with each other in an environment of trust. And if somebody let somebody down, and that wasn't an accident as it were, the other merchants came along, broke the bench in half and said, you don't have a place here. Your banco was rotto, you were bankrupt. Okay, credit, the word credit comes from credere, it is a belief. The word trust is found all over the financial world. Okay, these things are there because finance just happens to be a lubricant of type, but the underlying value is human ability to interact with each other, to build value with each other, and to do that in a way that we're not homogeneous. Right? The first instance I understood of things like, more detailed identity models like friend of a friend, if you actually look at the discount houses and accepting houses in the London money markets a few hundred years ago, right, what happened? The Silk Route or the trading routes have gone up. There'd been this explosion of trade, and you didn't have an easy way of people being able to exchange value because you didn't know the person on the other side. So some of the merchant houses set up outposts so that they would know people on the other side. But there was a centralized money market that still said, I no longer need to know this person on the other side. I only need to know the person who knows. So the accepting houses committee would accept a bill, and the discount houses would then discount the bill once it had been accepted. Right? That was 200 odd years ago, friend of a friend, before we started thinking about, Liberty Alliance or SAML or OAuth.
Or blockchain.
Or blockchain, okay? Because the point is that we are not trying to create new things as much as saying we are wanting to take very old things like trust from an environment where everybody lived and died in a small place to an environment where there is migration and there is connectivity. How do we scale that? Well, we've got to figure out ways of scaling it. But the fact that, a dollar of trade is worth $100 of aid is something that's been so deeply enmeshed in me, and it goes back to dignity and purpose. If you can give people purpose, many things get solved. If that purpose has value that you can sort of discover easily, even more things get solved. If that value is exchangeable for things where, 21st century versions of barter effectively happen because we're all able to create value and solve each other's problems on it. My father-in-law lives up in the mountains in a place called Cobdar, an hour and a half from Almeria in Spain. And the villages around there, you get things like 84-year-old dentists who wouldn't be able to work anywhere else, doesn't get paid for being a dentist, but he's still the only dentist in that village, and he gets paid because he never has to worry about his boiler not working, or roof tiles to be sorted out, or a window that's gone out of sync. Okay? Because they just work it out within the ecosystem. Community is important, but community begins by recognizing that we are not individuals with isolated historical models of income, of generation of value, or of exchange of value.
If there is, I think we have time for maybe one question, maybe two, if there is any.
He's getting used to how long my answers are.
Yeah, exactly. Depends on what the question is. I can't see anything. I'm blinded by the lights. Super.
Hey, JP. So I think my question is related to where you opened up on, which is, as I think about the transition that we're going through as a result of automation and AI, and particularly coming to financial services where it's going to be highly disruptive and also going to reduce jobs significantly, how do you feel, and you talked a little bit about the basic income equation and around that and finding places for people, but how do you really think about that in terms of the transition? I know there's an outcome that we can get to, which we all think we can there, but there's also a very significant transition that we're going to get through. And is that transition going to be peaceful? Is it going to be violent? Is it back to the sort of transition that France went through the French Revolution? How should we be thinking about that in terms of the highly disruptive nature of that from a social fabric perspective of hundreds of thousands and millions of people losing their jobs, not being able to find work, being pushed out of being productive people, losing their dignity along the way. How do you feel about that?
In 30 seconds.
Yeah.
30 seconds.
I'm a big fan of Amara's law, right? We tend to greatly overestimate the impact of technology shifts and their equivalent in the short term and greatly underestimate it in the long term, okay? I think that while we can paint doom and gloom scenarios, you cannot change the fact that there is anxiousness, but it's like saying, when do you expect generalized AI to be valuable, in the finance market today, or how long it would be before we have, blockchain-based trade finance systems working end-to-end everywhere. Getting pilots out, learning, being able to adopt that is easy. But to me, I remember in 1980 when I started in the UK, someone told me the paperless office is like the paperless loo, okay? And I watched the next 40 years of saying, well, there's still paper in the office, it's taking time, right? My wife still uses checks, but they are dying, right? I saw my first restaurant that wouldn't take cash, a coffee shop in central London a couple of years ago. So there are shoots of that change visible. But like with autonomous cars, which is a thing that most people come to me about, saying everybody drives long haul, look at this tension, all cars are going to be autonomous. My immediate instinct was saying, well, there is always someone who has to pay in the event of failure. Okay, there is when there is a breach, there has to be a method of payment, because that's how we form many parts of society. So what passes for insurance, what passes for saying, when this car drives over somebody, or when someone dies with an autonomous car accident, the idea that no one's going to pay is, to me, just cloud cuckoo land, right? There is going to be some form of formal recourse for the event of failure of these automated things. That takes time to implement. And that time to implement allows transition to understand many other things, because you start seeing, like with the masters of data, data curation was never important. Lineage and provenance was never important, but they had become important. Metadata and the ability to prevent, why do blockchain type things even exist? Saying, well, how do you actually know that something has persisted and has not changed, that immutability has been part of what you fixed? Well, again, there have been not just technology, but a mix of technology and people and culture to be able to make that transformation take place. And these things all take time. So will there be deep transformational effects as a result of these changes? Yes. But are we going to see millions of people? The jobs that exist today will not necessarily exist tomorrow. I've always believed that. But I've had to reinvent myself N times. When I joined, people used to be called, at best, MIS or DP managers. And then we started saying, CIOs and CTOs, or after a little bit of IT director. Many of the professional terms we use, at least in the industry I've been in, which is sort of tech meeting finance, didn't exist that long ago. And as these new forms come, and they appear to happen at whether you look at the transformation sort of technologies of the last 30 or 40 years, I haven't seen each of them come through with the kind of very heavy impact on the sort of the employment capability, because the tension has been more training. So it goes back to your education question. It's about lifelong learning, because you can't say education is about K-12. So the ability to teach people to be adaptive, a rust belt happens when you say we're going to have, sorry?
K80.
K80, yeah, or K90, or K retirement age +1. But but the premise to me, and that if that makes me sort of pinko lefty tree hugger utopian, then fine. But I actually believe that humans can solve that, because we tend to be anxious about the pace at which things are going to happen, and the actual changes required in order to form the social and commercial contracts needed. It's like how long fax took or how long digital signatures took. I was told it took 60-odd years.
The faxes still are alive and well in Luxembourg.
Okay. Yeah, but I was told that 500 years ago, thee and thou to become you took 60-odd years. Okay, so we can be threatened, we can resist change, we can adopt, we can learn how to adapt, and there will always be people who, because of social, our own society having weaknesses, like in education, we have not catered for the fact that we could create Rust Belts, okay? The fault is not in the people in the Rust Belt, but that we didn't think about it. Well, actually now I'm sort of thinking, long-haul truck drivers, we've been thinking about that for 15 years now, 20 years now, 25 years
What's
now.
interesting is that there's an acute shortage of them now, because people are adapting and they're not going into it because it's going to end.
And you can say that for
then
seismologists,
yeah.
for geophysicists, for the number of places where we've predicted doom and gloom, and then we've got an education problem because no one wants to learn it.
Yeah.
No one wants to teach it. Okay, and those things. So if we start actually saying we as society care about these things, then we will create the transition balances needed. And if we don't care about these things, then we are no different from feudal life, and we should expect the consequences thereof.
Super. Thanks so much, JP, for kicking us off.
Thank you.